Imagine a strategy game about the Romans that featured a turn-based overworld, but with real-time combat, that depicted entire armies clashing against each other. These conflicts would spread over regions that encompassed parts of Asia, all of Europe, the Mediterranean and North Africa. There would be city management, and there'd be army raising, and there'd be a dedicated strategic element in making sure that all these cities and their populace were happy enough to continue under your rule. You'd tactically move your units about this battle map in the turn-based environment, and then clash with enemy units, and that would then force the game into the real-time element. It's $1 million idea. I don't know why nobody has thought of it before. You could form alliances, you could civilize barbarous lands, or just conquer civilized lands that you didn't like. It could be one of the greatest games ever made. And last but not least, you could spill blood in the Colosseum or engage in chariot races. What, you thought I was talking about Rome Total War? Centurion's claim to fame is that it is Rome Total War, but released 14 years earlier, back in the heady days of 1990, with all the technological impairments that implies. There's no attempt at realism in regards to history here. There are all kinds of great historical generals and such, but they're all compressed into one specific area. The aesthetic is like those ancient classics. You know, the color epics, Ben-Hur, and all the biblical ones with those roaring soundtracks, and the same is done here with the MT32 device. You've got this huge sweeping epic before you that just sounds like it's ripe to be conquered. And because it's from 1990, that means it predates Civilization and Dune 2. So it predates the modern 4X strategy, and it predates the RTS, while having elements of both. This was the only title from a company called Bits of Magic. Bits of Magic were formed by Kellyn Beck, I think I'm saying that right, who had made their name making Cinemaware games. These were often strategy or adventure games that featured other mini-games and blended genres with a narrative-heavy focus, hence Cinemaware. The most successful of these for the developer was Defender of the Crown, a Robin Hood-inspired strategy game with lots of mini-games that Centurion is essentially the Roman version of. The problem with combining a whole pile of mini-games together is that, you know, every so often you'll come across chocolate and peanut butter and it'll just work, and then other times you'll try a mini-game and it doesn't work out so well. You can tell which ones worked because Creative Assembly took them and rejected the others in this spiritual successor of Centurion, which is Rome Total War. So if you go into Centurion, having played the Total War games, you'll probably be in for a bit of a shock. You'll be like, oh, I know this game, I know how to play this game, and so I did. I immediately clicked on one of my regions and sent my legions out to invade the Alps. And lo and behold, rather than having diplomats running around the map, you have the opportunity to negotiate with the leaders of the region directly. This in itself is a minigame, which features dialogue and branching conversations of a sort. It's very simplistic, and you have to hit the right combinations of things, otherwise they'll not be happy and they'll declare war on you, which means you either have to tactfully withdraw or engage in combat immediately. Since I'm not very diplomatic, that resulted in a lot of crushing barbarians at my heel. Rather than selecting units directly, you're in control of the regions that the units reside in. So you click on the region, and then you focus on the troops within that region screen and tell them to move. The troops themselves will be represented by soldiers on the map, but they'll be part of the region that they're in. It's a subtle difference from Rome Total War, but it kind of works. The different leaders that you come across have different personalities, different dispositions depending on your actions, and will respond differently to different ideas. If you choose to threaten one group, they might want to wish for a second opportunity. If you threaten another, they will plan to carve your face off for the indignity of doing so. You know, it really does depend on who you're dealing with. Every region you enter has a nice rendered screen at the top and a bit of descriptive text underneath, explaining the lay of the land and whether it will be difficult for your troops, and the armies that reside there and whether they're brave or weak or whether their leader knows what he's doing. It immerses you in the world quite nicely. When you finally and inevitably come into contact with somebody who wants to kill you, you are brought to an isometric battle screen. Rather than a free camera, you have the full length of the battlefield to view, and you have a general on the map. The proximity of your general and his general stats actually affect the battle. If your general is close to your troops, not only will he inspire them, but you'll be able to move them. This is only for the higher difficulties. Generally, if you set up a specific formation, which is historically accurate, Rome did use these formations, and then tell the forces afterwards to unleash the legion, it generally works out on the easier levels. I started with Scipio's defense, which makes my units hold their ground. And then when I decided that the enemy had been drawn in close enough, especially if they rode with their general up front, I would unleash the legion and a pincer movement would engage, and I would surround the units. Unless they had cavalry and tried to flank me, in which case I set my troops off a bit earlier. And that's the thing, different generals have different formations, different styles of fighting, and different unit compositions. There isn't as great a unit variety in the game, but it's enough to sort of keep you on your toes, especially later in the game when you proceed into regions that are heavily fortified. Unlike other strategy games, you have a level yourself. There's a limited number of troops that you can control initially. You have to learn and grow through conquest and appeasing the Senate and the people, and then you rise in rank and you're able to gain more troops to command, allowing further expansion. The top rank is Caesar or Kaiser, and it is very, very difficult to obtain. I didn't manage it. But on the lesser ranks, you can still wield mighty armies to put down both rebels and invaders and conquer future lands that should be yours by right of Roman conquest. Speaking of conquest, there's less regions to take control of, and there's less micromanagement in this game. The strategy elements are more simple, and they are like a proof of concept to what would come later in the genre itself. It follows the tried and trusted method of gain more regions, gain more taxation, gain more gold to pay your troops and raise mighty armies. But if you tax people too much, they will grow unruly, and they will rebel and take the entire populace with them, and the region will no longer be yours. So you have a sort of mini-game of strategy within your general conquering strategy, where you have to maintain order within the regions that you've conquered, which becomes increasingly difficult throughout the course of the game. It feels weird in a way. I'm telling you about all these gameplay features, and anyone who's played Total War will be like, oh right, okay James, it's Total War. Every so often an invading army will appear on the map, and if you try and take them out, you'll have to conquer the army and the region itself after. This is exceedingly difficult to do, especially if the first army whittles down the number of troops you have, because the troop levels are persistent. Legions can be upgraded and replenished based on the number of populace within the region, and as they grow in stature during battle, generals' reputations will precede themselves and troops will be more willing to fight for them. Occasionally there will be invasions of the Roman populace by Carthage and the like. You might want to garrison an additional troop in Rome on the harder ones. or have a significant sea force in a defensive posture. And now we come to the minigames. You can have gladiatorial events, you can have horse racing in chariots that you can bet upon, and you have the ship-to-ship combat. None of these minigames are particularly good, but by winning them, it expedites your rise up the ranks as people become more enamored with how wonderful a leader you are and your reputation soars. While if you don't hold these games, it will cause the populace to riot quicker. Random events happen, some of them positive, some of them negative, and Rome's reputation, again, is at stake with some of them. The ship combat was something that I hated, because the manual did not give controls for the ship combat. So, despite winning multiple victories, I still managed to lose my ships somehow. I don't know. I applaud the team for their effort to try and bring naval combat to the game long before Creative Assembly ever did, but this one's a bit of a dud. It's not great. Unfortunately, certain regions are on islands, so you do kind of need a large ship element in order to succeed. Or you can swiftly build a fleet when there's no other fleet on the map and ferry your forces across before you come into contact with any of them. But it's hit and miss, you know? Sometimes there'll be an enemy fleet on the map blocking your way the entire time. If there's always ships there and they always sink your ships because you're too stupid to learn the ship minigame, then places like Britain and Sardinia are out of your reach, and you can't win the game. The longer the game goes on, the more unrest you'll have to deal with under the yoke of your oppression. And the more there will be barbarian invasions, and the more your emboldened opposition will strike out at you at your weakest points. And it becomes much like Rome Total War in that you feel like you're plugging gaps, only for several other holes to appear in the wall and leaks to spring out when you least needed them. Due to the hard cap on armies as well, you can't raise enough of a military force to cover all the cities when they start to get a bit rebellious. This is frustrating, but was remedied by the spiritual successor in Rome. And that sums up Centurion, essentially. It's Rome Total War in the DOS era, and unfortunately for it, it's been rendered completely irrelevant and part of history as more of a historical curiosity than a game, simply because the original Rome Total War was so good. It borrowed ideas wholesale from this game, blatantly I might say, and improved upon them in every single way, shape and form. Centurion itself didn't have that great a critical reception. Some magazines loved it, others hated it, and I think it was because people just didn't know what they were dealing with. And I'm sure many of them would look back in hindsight, slap their forehead and go, "Oh right, that was the beginning of that," because it was the genesis of the Total War genre as we know it. It does make me wonder, had this game been more critically acclaimed, whether the likes of Creative Assembly would have existed at all. Perhaps Bits of Magic would have made Centurion 2 in the mid-90s, been inspired by Impression's games and gone on to dominate the genre. We'll never know. Throughout playing it, and I did have fun playing it, it was a very enjoyable game, it felt like, you ever see those documents that Leonardo drew of like tanks and helicopters, and you're like, that is hundreds of years ahead of its time? That's what playing Centurion felt like. It was a whole decade between Centurion's release and the first Total War game. That is like hundreds of years in gaming time. In the end, it's playable, still, even to this day, but it's more a masterpiece of design ideas and creativity than execution itself. At the end of the day, Centurion is a solid DOS strategy game, and people who enjoy DOS strategy games should seek it out. It's not overly complex, it's not overly difficult to pick up, and if you're a fan of Total War and want to see what influenced it in the first place, it's always there to give a wee play. The problem with doing so is that this game from 1990 just is not designed to be played after the likes of Rome Total War. Lonnie, away!